All right, just for a heads up, this is going to be a two-part video for today, so you do need to watch both parts for section 4 or lesson 4 today. So this will be part 1, and part 2 will be loaded up right away as well. So please make sure you watch both. So aftermath of Reconstruction. How does Reconstruction come to an end? That's what we're talking about today. Vocabulary for today is Compromise of 1877, poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause, segregation, Jim Crow laws, Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a Supreme Court case, and the New South. So Reconstruction had brought both positive change and turmoil to the South. And the end of Reconstruction led to new hardships for African Americans in the South. So this is everything we're going to talk about today. So by the 1870s, radical Republicans were starting to lose power. Many Northerners are finally growing weary of trying to reform the South because all the South is trying to do is hold on to the ways it used to be. And so it was a time to let Southerners run their own governments, they said, even if it meant that African Americans in the South might lose their rights. And so the disclosure of widespread corruption will also hurt Republicans during this time period. We talked a little bit about how those state governments in the South were kind of like misusing funds that they were given. And President Grant would also appoint many friends to government offices, and some would use their position to steal large sums of money from the government, which makes them look really bad. And Grant won re-election in 1872, but many Northerners had lost faith in Republicans and their policies. Congress also passed the Amnesty Act in 1872, and it restored the right to vote to nearly all white Southerners, including former Confederates. And these white Southerners voted solidly Democratic, and at the same time, they employed violence in order to prevent African Americans from voting. So essentially, they're going to be suppressing African Americans from voting and also the Republicans in the South from voting. And by 1876, only three Southern states, South Carolina, Florida, and Tennessee, will remain under Republican control. Everything else at this point is basically going to flip back Democrats. And so the end of Reconstruction will come with the election of 1876. And the Democrats will nominate Samuel Tilden, who's the governor of New York, for president. And the Republicans choose Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. And both these guys are candidates that vowed to fight corruption. Um, sorry, during Reconstruction, corruption became a very big thing. And so both these guys are going to basically come, sorry, the understanding that something needs to be done about this. And Tilden won the popular vote, but he had only 184 electoral votes, which was one short of the number needed to win. Therefore, the outcome of the election will hang on 20 disputed electoral votes, and 19 were from three states that had not yet been reconstructed. Those states were South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. And Democrats in these states accused Republican election officials of throwing out Democratic votes. And so this is going to create a bit of tension now between the two sides. And so as inauguration day came near, the nation still had no winner to swear in as president. And the Republican controlled Congress would set up a special commission to settle the crisis, which was the crisis is that there's no president to swear in. And so the commission, made up mostly of Republicans, gave all the disputed electoral votes to Hayes, which is kind of awkward. So Southern Democrats could have fought the decision, but instead they agreed to support the commission's decision in return for a promise by Hayes to end Reconstruction, and this will be known as the Compromise of 1877. So under the Compromise of 1877, Hayes will become president, but Hayes will then also end Reconstruction. And once in office, Hayes removed all remaining federal troops from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, and Reconstruction was now over. So Reconstruction had deep and lasting impact on Southern politics. White Southerners had bitter memories of radical Republican policies and military rule. For the next 100 years, the South remained a stronghold of the Democratic Party, and at the same time, Southern African Americans will steadily lose most of their political rights. And as federal troops withdrew from the South, conservative Democrats found new ways to keep African Americans from exercising their rights. Many of these laws specifically intended to prevent African Americans from voting. They're trying to take away the voting rights of African Americans mainly. And over time, southern states would pass poll taxes, which required voters to pay a fee each time they voted, and as a result, free men could rarely afford to vote now. States also imposed a literacy test that required voters to read and explain a section of the Constitution. But since most freemen had little education, such tests would keep them from voting. And election officials also applied different standards to black and white voters. So if you're black, well, you have a much higher chance of having harder questions, whereas if you're white, it's a lot easier. And blacks who were able to read often had to answer more difficult questions than whites did, which really wasn't fair at all. And I mean, that's pretty clear. And still, many poor whites could not have passed any literacy tests. So, in order to increase the number of white voters, states will then pass the grandfather clauses. And so these laws stated that if a voter's father or grandfather had been eligible to vote on or before January 1st, 1867, which is the date after Johnson had restored rebels' right to vote, the voter did not have to take a literacy test. So you're grandfathered in now is basically where the term comes from. And no African Americans in the South could vote before 1868, so the only effect of the grandfather clause was to ensure that white men could vote. And so after 1877, you're going to see segregation or separation of races become a law of the South, and blacks and whites kept separate from each other in schools, restaurants, theaters, trains, streetcars, playgrounds, hospitals, and even cemeteries by Jim Crow laws. So, Jim Crow laws are any law basically dealing with segregation or being created to hurt African Americans and their rights. And so, in some cases, African Americans were restricted to completely separate facilities altogether. And that practice will become more and more popular towards the end of the 80s and or into the 1800s, sorry, and through the 1900s, all the way pretty much up to like 1953, which we'll talk about more in high school. In other facilities, in others, I'm sorry, states, facilities were divided with favorable areas reserved for whites only, which means no African American would be allowed to sit there. And African Americans brought lawsuits to challenge segregation now. In 1896, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was legal so long as facilities for blacks and whites were equal. However, facilities were rarely equal. And it won't be until, like I said, like I believe it's 1953 with the ruling on Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, which we'll talk all about in high school, that this whole thing of separate but equal will be overturned. And so many freedmen will also now start leaving the South. So their treatment as second-class citizens will push many freedmen out of the South. Some will choose to stay there, but for some, they're going to choose to leave because of these laws. African Americans in northern cities also would publish newspapers to help their brethren in the South cope with their new challenges, and they often encouraged free men to come north because factories needed more workers, and the factories would even send recruiters to the South to try to get these freedmen to come north and fill these empty jobs. And some would also join the U.S. Army and would become Buffalo Soldiers and protected settlers as they moved westward, and also would be used to help enforce federal laws. And so they would be used primarily out west. And actually, in the Spanish American War, which we'll talk about when you guys get to high school, they will actually serve very, very honorably and bravely as well. And during this time period, you will see 16 African American, 14 African American Buffalo soldiers receiving the Medal of Honor, which is the highest award any soldier can earn for combat. And so we should be able to finish. So hopefully, here we go. How did the South rebuild its economy now? So during Reconstruction, the South made modest progress towards rebuilding its agricultural economy. By 1880, planters were growing as much cotton as they had in 1860, which is great for them. And after Reconstruction, a new generation of Southern leaders worked to expand and diversify the economy now. So they didn't want to solely rely on cotton and agriculture. So Atlanta journalist Henry Grady described quote unquote a new South that used its vast natural resources to build up its own industry instead of depending on the North. So instead of relying on northern factories, the South needs to do this now. And so in 1880, the entire South still produced fewer finished textiles than Massachusetts, like a state. And in the next decade, more communities built textile mills to turn cotton into cloth. So after 1880, you're going to see a lot more factories and textile mills start turning up in the South to help produce cloth. And the tobacco industry will also grow in the South. In North Carolina, James Duke used new machinery to revolutionize the manufacturing of tobacco products. Because of this, Duke's American Tobacco Company eventually controlled 90% of the nation's tobacco industry, which is huge. And the New South also used its natural resources to develop new industries other than those based on farming. And with its large deposits of iron ore and coal, Alabama became a center of the steel industry. And oil refineries will spring up in Louisiana and Texas, and other states produced copper, granite, and marble. By the 1890s, many northern forests had been cut down, and the southern yellow pine competed with the northwestern white pine as a lumber source. So, lumber industry, oil refineries, mining is all going to start becoming huge in the South. And southern factories will produce cypress shingles and hardwood furniture now. And so, factories, farming, and mining will modify the South's physical environment. Clearing land and using the natural resources provided jobs and opportunities, and the South's wood, steel, and other products were used in industries around the country. The South had developed a more balanced economy by 1900, but still, the South did not keep up with the even more rapid growth in the North and the West. So, this is the end of our section. When you guys come back to American history in high school, this is pretty much right where we are going to be picking up. Um, so it's been a good year with you guys, and it's sad that we can't be together for the end part here. But all you guys have to do for your last assignment is to take the Section 4 quiz on the book's website, and there will be no exam. And as far as how your grades are going to work, if you worked hard, and I think you worked hard and did the assignments, then you will not get a letter grade for the fourth marking period. But I will be bumping your third marking period grades, which will help you guys out even more than anything else I can really do for you right now. So please make sure you bring your books back to the school at some point. There will be an announcement on how you guys are supposed to do that because remember, these are brand new books, so we are trying to take care of them a little bit. So if you have any questions or need anything, please feel free to reach out and contact me.